Thank you very much. I am very happy to be here among you. I'm happy to see the faces of the students as well. I myself have listened to a couple of those conversations in the past, and as we know, producing knowledge is the most common task that humanity can take, so it's always an exchange. And I learn from what I hear. I hope that you will learn something from what I will say, but also that I will learn from your questions. I jumped on the possibility that Professor Madhav drew, which was to present not just one, but several of my exhibitions. And I was myself curious to see what would happen if I do that. I've never done it before. To see, maybe I will see something in a perspective, but most exciting for me is to hear your questions and see how they present themselves when we see them from a perspective together. I will share my screen now. I will, because my most recent exhibition about Ukrainian artists is the most timely and it only closed a few days ago, I will devote the most of time to it. And before I will discuss the Unheroic Act and Eco-Feminism. So altogether there will be 3 group shows, and those 2 first I will just sketch in general their ideas and certain concepts that they aimed to present. If you feel, it may feel like too much information, I don't know, we will see. I want to let you know that everything is thoroughly documented on my website, meaning all the essays, catalogs, Zoom conversations with the artists, press, all sorts of documents are all together in one place on my website, and you can always check them. And also I'll be very happy to answer questions once we go through the presentation. So the Unheroic Act, Representations of Rape in Contemporary Women's Art in the US, is the exhibition that I curated at John Jay College of Criminal Justice here in New York at CUNY in the fall of 2018. This concentrated survey of works of art devoted to rape represented 3 generations of a diverse roster of women artists and aimed to fill a gap in the history of art. Rape is, here are a few images of the installation. Rape is a classical theme in Western iconography. Depictions of rapes of Europa, Proserpina, and the Sabines were created by and for men. Only in the last 50 years, when women finally gained admission to the art world, could they offer their perspective on the subject. Since I began the research in December of 2014, until when the exhibition opened in the fall of 2018, I identified hundreds of artworks about rape, counting only those by really well-known artists, and several hundreds more of artists who were much less known. Yet, as I noted in the catalog back in 2018, such often strikingly beautiful works are rarely shown, or if they are, their true meaning is frequently obscured. That changed to a certain degree, we have to admit, which is a great news. The aim of the Unheroic Act was to demonstrate that rape constitutes one of the central themes in women's art and to analyze its rich iconography. The exhibition title refers to Susan Brown Miller's phrase, heroic rape. Susan Brown Miller is the author of a foundational book, Against Our Will, Men, Women, and Rape, which was published in 1975. So her phrase, heroic rape, characterizes the male glamorization of rape as a dramatic struggle culminating in romantic submission. What makes works by women radically different from those by men is the focus not on the action or drama, but on the lasting psychological devastation of the victim, her suffering, shame, silence, and loneliness. This divide was insightfully presented by G. Roger Denson with regards to figurative works mostly made between 1970 and 2000, and these took place the previous one, and current are from the article by Roger Denson, which was one of very few sources summarizing art on rape by women artists available in 2018. It was an article. Figurative works are easiest to identify with the subject. Yet the female perspective becomes more complicated when we take into account non-figurative works based on text or abstraction, where artists focus on asserting women's control over cultural narrative, as well as when we include the most recent works by artists of the generation that finally speaks about rape unapologetically. These works focus on regaining control over the victim's sexuality and psyche. And this is simply all the works that were presented in my exhibition. So I wanted to kind of show you visually the difference between the assumption or just focusing on one decade, mostly 1990s, and figurative art, and what is if we probe a little broader, without, of course, meaning that I've done the whole research that is possible. That is obviously not possible for any exhibition. The Unheroic Act was not so much an exhibition about rape as about the iconography of rape. The curatorial selection took into account 5 elements all at the same time. The first 3 generations of artists, the earliest work was done in 1968, it was Yoko Ono's, and the most recent in 2018, a social practice project which we did during the show together with the students of the school. Ethnic diversity, Native American artists, African American, Asian Americans, and Latinas were included. All visual mediums from drawing to social practice. And finally, the last 2, which are the most interesting. Themes that inspired artists to address rape, from fairy tales to rape as a war crime. And finally, varied visual languages that artists choose to tackle such sensitive subjects, from symbolism to performative reenactment. And let's just look at some visuals following the iconography itself. So focusing on number 4 here, the subjects that inspired artists, or not to think about rape, but to make their artworks. So among them, there were such subjects as PTSD, domestic violence, child abuse. I will go a little slower, but I'm not going to give you too much information because we would spend a long time here. That's also a work devoted to child abuse. Then in the public arena, how rape is presented to us in a public space. Media coverage of sensational cases, which is the subject of Suzanne Lacey's 3 Weeks in May. College rape culture. Barely anyone remembers that this is what inspired Anna Mendietta's iconic work. Andrea Bowers was also inspired by college rape culture, but she also touched upon the role of social media in her work, criminal trials, and responsibility of public institutions. That's also a work tied to college rape culture. Guerrilla Girls Broadband organized a workshop with the students of John Jay College, which brought as a result these 2 posters. That's us workshopping. Rape as a war crime, Jenny Holzer and Carolithia. Rape in the Military by Jennifer Carady. Kara Walker, Slavery, Senganangudi. Rape Epidemic on Indian Reservations, the work by Alaskan artist Sonia Kelleher-Combs. Women trafficking, that's the case of prostitutes and women on the border of Mexico and the US in the series of photographs by Ada Trio. Rape in Public and Political Discourse, Guerrilla Girls, and Bangul Han interpreting here the banter, the locker room banter by President Trump. and visual and literary tradition, especially art history. Susanna and the elders here. Sabina's. And then mythology. This is an Iranian artist, and fairy tales, Natalie Frank. And finally, the relationship between rape and gender, and in understanding that rape is an abuse of power, and it does not necessarily have to take a sexual form. So the Unheroic Act thus examined remarkably varied visual languages artists employed in order to evoke feelings as contrasting as empathy and shock. Some employ realism, others symbolism, sometimes verging on abstraction. Some aim for a poetic beauty in opposition to the act itself in an attempt not to victimize again. Some avoid depicting the female body altogether and use text instead. Others contest classical iconography through subversive representation, or complicate the relationship between reality and fiction in paradocumentary treatment. Yet other artists employ performative reenactment, activism, or conceptual instruction. The artistic language of expression does not follow any specific subject which provided the inspiration. Rather, expression follows the artist's intention to shock, to remember, to meditate, to heal, or to express anger and pain. So that's a quick sketch of the first exhibition. As I say, catalog, public talks, everything is available on my website. There was a symposium, and I believe its recording is still available. Ecofeminisms was an unusual exhibition for me because I thought of it as of a form of activism and means of inquiry, not a research conclusion. The Unheroic Act was the result of 3 years of work, where I selected 20 works out of 300 in a way that made the exhibition representative of American society, or at least I believed so, providing a cross-section of 3 generations, different racial groups, the recurring themes through which artists address rape, and all visual mediums. Each element was therefore a carefully selected piece of the puzzle. Removing one would create a hole in the fabric. In the case of ecofeminisms, it was the other way around. I have been working on this topic since the spring of 2019, and I was just starting to look for an institution where I could show this exhibition, maybe in 2 or 3 years. When Thomas Urban, the owner of Thomas Urban Gallery in Chelsea, asked if I could do an exhibition about ecofeminism in his gallery. He had no idea that I had already been working on it. It was a sheer conjunction of planets. And of course, a commercial gallery has its limitations: small space, the manner of presentation, which gives short shrift to deeper analysis, and very different audience. So I thought of it for a moment, but I decided to agree. And what prompted me to organize this exhibition was that at the time I was on the jury of the AIM fellowship program for young artists at the Bronx Museum of the Arts. And I noticed that out of several hundred applications that we received, only 6 mentioned environmental protection, nature, water, or climate change. That is the fall of 2019, only 3 years ago. It alarmed me, and I thought that my exhibition may not need to be comprehensive, but it must be shown as soon as possible to provoke a discussion about the state of the planet. Again, not the only reason for this discussion. It just so happens that feminists, driven by ecological sensitivity, had already proposed in the 1970s and 80s some of the most radical art projects that still remain almost completely unknown. The exhibition was accompanied by an essay and analysis of individual artworks and an extensive public program that remains available online. My curatorial walkthrough for interviews with artists and other curators and critics, and an interview with me and the gallery owner organized by Christie's. The exhibition got about 10 reviews, and what the most important, in the following year at the College of Art Association, I was chairing one of the sessions devoted to ecofeminism, and I presented about 2 or 3 papers. So it really became part of my research that went way beyond this exhibition and what it presented, and I should go back to it. So I was really interested in tracing whether the topics that were important to second wave feminists are still relevant and for whom. I chose 28 works by 16 artists, half of whom were the pioneers of ecofeminist art and half the representatives of younger generations. I adopted the principle that rather than presenting single, isolated ecofeminist projects, I would focus on artists who had devoted their entire lives or a significant part of their career to the issues of ecofeminism. I thought that I would simply learn more. Ecofeminist art emerged in the, oh, let me take it away from your eyes because you will be reading it. It supports the next paragraph. Ecofeminist art emerged in the late 60s when the development of conceptual art, spiritual feminism, and the exclusion of women from the art market drove feminist artists far beyond the limitations of painting and traditional presentation in art galleries to create new genres of art, such as social practice and eco-art, and take it literally to new territories. The anti-war movements of the 1960s and 70s and the environmental protests of the 1980s played a major role. Ecofeminist art is a very broad phenomenon, and its development over the years can be compared to the development of all-encompassing geography, a science both natural and social. Yet, while the literature of ecofeminism as theory or activism is vast, the literature of ecofeminist art is limited and scattered. It was omitted from all major feminist art exhibitions, such as WAC, Art and the Feminist Revolution in 2007. And I listed not to criticize WAC, it's my favorite feminist exhibition of all time, and its curator is a dear friend of mine. And it's just to note that ecofeminism was completely beyond our scope of interest back in 10 years ago or 5 years ago. Its scope and riches are well known only to specialists of eco art. When planning the exhibition, I was interested whether the evolving definition of gender has definitely shifted ecofeminist art from its essentialist concerns, such as goddess art, to areas where gender no longer matters, and therefore ecofeminist art becomes more difficult to distinguish from ecological art. So that's all I learned from my exhibition, only this one plate. The features that characterize nearly all early ecofeminist works from the early 60s through the early 1990s are, first of all, their foundation in spiritual feminism, which proposed to end the dualism between culture and nature. Secondly, the belief that patriarchal religions and philosophies are the common sources of the abuse of women, and we have the connection to my previous exhibition already, abuse of nature, and the abuse of indigenous peoples. And third, finally, formal inventiveness rooted in the philosophy of ecofeminism and feminism. The radical rejection of painting, typical of all conceptual art, in this case was motivated by the exclusion of women from the art market and their ecological awareness. And there are 4 responses to the way how art is being focused on traditional painting and on presentation in traditional white cube space is foursome in ecofeminisms, and I will use illustrations to show them to you. So I'm sorry, I should have omitted Barbara Kruger from this presentation too much. So they turned to art made from natural materials that decompose. For example, Bilge Friedlander in her Cedar Forest, referring to the myths of Gilgamesh, and works by Cecilia Vicuña, whom you probably all know, made by natural or found materials. Another characteristic choice is contestation of monumentalism and creating works in landscape that leave no or minimal permanent footprint, in contrast to the classical land art. The focus is on caring for nature, not marking the territory, and permanently changing the environment. This is Ana Mendieta's work, some 3 decades after it was originally created. Or as in examples by this young artist, Hane Utamura, who performed in open space, leaving no trace of her activity. Feminists also rejected the concept of a finished masterpiece and sought to create art that rendered natural life cycle and changes such as growth or aging. Examples include the works by Elena Ilon, Agnes Denis, and Aviva Rahmani. And you already know how many of these artists' names do not sound familiar to you. I don't expect you to know Aviva Rahmani's work very well, or Elena Ilon. As many as I think 3 or 4 works in the show have not been shown over 40 years since they were created, until I showed them in Eco-Feminisms. All this led to a radical departure from the traditional art presentation in gallery space. Ecofeminists, especially garbage girls, as Lucy Lippard jokingly called them, that is, artists who deal with pollution and the remediation of waste, have pushed the boundaries of the definition of art and proposed the most radical art forms so far, the art of repairing environmental damage. And here is an example of Betsy Damon's work, which I presented in the exhibition, but this is what we could not show, of course, in a gallery. That's a garden that cleans water from a river in Chinese city Chengdu using only biological methods. Or a project by Aviva Rahmani, where she repaired the damage on the island in Maine. These features define canonical ecofeminist art of white American women that grew out of spiritual feminism of the 1970s. It is worth remembering that the best ecofeminist projects were created between the mid-1980s and the mid-1990s, when these artists were already mature, that is, when no one was interested in them anymore. As I mentioned, 3 artworks in the show were shown publicly for the first time since their creation and original presentation. And these are iconic artworks of ecofeminism. It is much more difficult to define ecofeminist art today. It became a much more complex phenomenon because the understanding of gender has changed significantly, and the essentialist views of early feminists are archaic for many. On the other hand, they remain salient. On the other hand, they remain salient for many female artists of color, especially indigenous artists. The concept of Mother Earth and the incorporation of tradition are very important to their feminism. Yet, there are also indigenous artists for whom this tradition is outdated. They see ecofeminist art as ecopolitical activism and part of the struggle to get their land back. Ecofeminism, and therefore I call the show Ecofeminisms, is a polyphony and often contradictory, apparently or in fact. For example, there are artists working with endangered species in the context of posthumanism, and Native Americans who hunt animals and use their fur in their ecofeminist art. This is the same artist, who's Alaskan artist, Tonya Kelly-Combs, whose work I've shown before in the exhibition about rape. Ecofeminist art in the 21st century is primarily characterized by growing interest in designing futuristic proposals for the life on Earth. project of speculative feminism centered on posthumanism and anti-speciesism, as in this example of work by Jessica Segal, by anti-capitalist and anti-imperial projects denouncing global corporate strategies, as in the works by Mary Mattingly and Eliza Evans. That's the work about extraction. Created for my exhibition and now developing, being developed further by the artist in collaboration with the new museum. So I expect this project to have a long life. It's a terrific project. And by collaborative projects with scientists, such as this case of a work by Lynn Hirschman-Leeson. So that is what I have to say about ecofeminism, or as much as I can tell us. And let's jump into the war. By now, you probably have a question ready for me why I always curate exhibitions about traumas, but hopefully they also give us some hope or tools to witness only, rather than just focus on the trauma itself. Women at War was created entirely different than the two last exhibitions, even if ecofeminisms didn't wait 2 or 3 years when I could present it in an institution. Women at War were in a way worse for a curator, but that happens to independent curators, that you can react very quickly to a situation that is developing, that is going on. In this case, Friedman Gallery invited me to be a curator in residence for a year, and we agreed on a summer exhibition and on my writing an essay about one of their artists. And I prepared a show, and everything was ready, except for I didn't inform the artists yet. It was all written, it was all illustrated on paper. And then the war broke out on February 24th in Ukraine. And Ilya Friedman asked me whether I would not trash my own project and start anew and do something that would showcase the artists of Ukraine. And of course, my first reaction was, no way. 3 months? That was 17th of March when we had this conversation. Let me not tell you how short my research was, because it would not make you think very highly of me. But the truth is that I have roots in Eastern Europe. I'm not Ukrainian, and this was one of the main reasons why I doubted whether I should curate this exhibition. But at the same time, I recognized that we might have an incredible opportunity between the three of us, meaning Voloshin Gallery based in Kiev and now Nomadic Gallery in Miami, which was the first to turn to Friedman. Friedman Gallery in New York, which was willing to organize it, and really willing to organize it, fully devoted to the subject. And me, who was just about to fly to Venice and Warsaw and spend a month in Europe, where I thought I could find artworks that would be in public collections or meet with the artists. Nevertheless, I said, okay, let me try. And I put 2 conditions on it. It has to be an exhibition about women because it ties to my research, and I will be able to use the knowledge that I already have, and I will be able to include these artists maybe in my future projects. Secondly, it has to have a subject that is broader than this one war, so that it does not become an ad hoc exhibition that would not be of interest when time passes, but maybe it can be something that contributes to our general understanding of art and of the society in which we live. And I came up with the idea of feminist historiography, and that's how this exhibition was created. Women at War introduced some of the leading women artists working in Ukraine today and provided a context for the current war. Several works in the exhibition were made after February 24th, 2022, when Russia began the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Others date from the 8 years of war following the annexation of Crimea and the creation of separatist Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics in Donbass in 2014. War is central to history. History has been written and painted by men. This exhibition provided a platform for women's narrators of history and also examined gendered perspectives of war. And I think it's important for me to say that while I provided the platform, or it was my initial intention to provide a platform for women narrators of history, I had no idea what I would hear or see. So it only became real during the research, and also when you hang works in one space and when they start speaking to each other, you see more layers in them. Women are generally absent from the historical accounts of war, but violating a woman is seen as a violation of land and nation. Media images reinforce the perception of gender divide. But is war indeed gendered? Women comprise circa 25% of the Ukrainian armed forces. Russian soldiers rape Ukrainian civilians of all and no genders, including adult men. Yet the majority experience remains tied to the traditional gender roles. Many artists in this exhibition struggle with the notion of victimhood and pose the question in what way women have agency during war. The exhibition also offered an insight into Eastern European feminisms, which are significantly different from the Western mold. It contributes to the discourse about how national identity is tied to the perception of women's role in society. There are parallels between the fight for Ukraine's independence and the fight for the equality of Ukrainian women, stemming from the paradoxes of the Soviet Union, where early modernist, anti-nationalist, and feminist promises became but a fig leaf of propaganda for the increasingly brutal and misogynist patriarchal regime. The image of masculinized, liberated women in public art that we all know from Soviet art belied the reality. Women were exhausted and their conduct was scrutinized, while Soviet leaders bestowed and took away their rights, always in order to boost productivity or population growth. By contrast, the image of feminized men never entered the public space. The misogyny of these policies was masked by the progressive language of propaganda, which misled women doing double duty in the entire Eastern Bloc into a false belief that they were equal. After the dissolution of the USSR, Ukrainian women turned away from the Soviet ideal of womanhood toward a traditional model of femininity at the expense of gender equality, and 2 decades passed before the feminist ideals became relevant again. In independent Ukraine, torn between its colonial past, the unimaginable wounds of the 20th century, the Holodomor, which was a forced famine under Stalin, owing to which between 2 and 3 million Ukrainians died, 2 world wars and a Holocaust, the aspirations of belonging to the West and the actuality of an endemic crisis became obsessed with history. Art of the 2010s was largely focused on the discussion of whether national identity should draw directly upon the short period of pre-Soviet independence or include the legacy of the Ukrainian SSR. The new generation of artists turned their attention to historiography, how history is written, who writes it, who and what remains invisible. Soviet painting, especially interpretations of World War II, came into focus for many. Others organized around the critique of the communization, the destruction of Soviet monuments and mosaics in Donbas, spearheaded by the post-Maidan government in 2015, and turned toward the blanked out pages of history. And let's look at some of the artworks, because this exhibition is so fresh in my memory, but it's the first time that I'm sort of guiding anyone through it without being in the actual space of the exhibition. I was struggling today in what order to put images. There is, of course, no chronology. There is a center, but there is no chronology or linear progression of the works. Or dividing them in some themes. I don't think that this is possible, but for the sake of this conversation, I could tell that that women propose feminist historiography as artists in a few different ways. First of all, in the way that we sort of expect, through showing the fate of women during the war. But other than that, which is much more interesting to me, I have to say, is when they don't necessarily focus on women, but they focus on how history is created and recorded, and they oppose it. They oppose the traditional patriarchal storytelling that became history. And they propose the focus on the defeated rather than on the victorious, to summarize it generally. So let me discuss these, giving you example of a few artworks. The agency of the victim and gender roles of women in wartime are explored by Alena Grom in the series of photographs Womb, by Oksana Czepełek in her video Letter from Ukraine, and by Dana Kavelina in her drawings Communications, Exit to the Blind Spot, which you are looking at. Kavelina searches for a way to bring back subjectivity to women victims of war who were purposefully destroyed by repeated rapes. In Donbas during the last 8 years, in rape camps established in the 1990s by the Serbs in Bosnia and Herzegovina, during the 1941 Lviv pogroms by the Germans and the Ukrainians, and during the deportations of the Chechens in 1944 as part of the forced resettlement of ethnic minorities in the Soviet Union between the 1930s and the 1950s. The series of drawings, Communications, Exit to the Blind Spot, which Kavelina created in 2019 at the age of, my goodness, that's 3 years ago, so she was 24, reveals interconnections among war rapes, childbearing, and the concept of a nation in which a woman is seen as a vessel to perpetuate community defined by blood. That's especially the case of this drawing. The writing is significant. She wrote nation from Latin, giving birth. This one she described as woman kills the son of the enemy. This one says honor, dishonor. And this one, the enemy to lie. They were first shown at the 2019 exhibition War in the Museum at the Kmytov Museum in Ukraine, which juxtaposed Soviet paintings of victory in World War II with works by contemporary Ukrainian feminist artists. Kavelina wrote in the accompanying text, "Every war is a war against women. Any quote unquote winner's story is glued together by a woman's bloody lingerie." Oksana Czepełek reflects on gender roles in Letter from Ukraine, the video, which a still from which you see here. In it, the plight of a mother is abstracted into a choreography to ominous music of the Ukrainian world music quartet Daka Braka. Filmed in a peaceful and quiet Italian town, a woman is seen escaping imagined shelling with a boy, in an image that points to the war role of a woman who is a mother, but also to recurring nightmares of those who escaped. A war does not leave winners behind, but those who survived, wrote Alena Grom. In her series Womb from 2018 that you're looking at now, Grom explores the phenomenon of increased birth rate during wartime. The photographs are based on the stories of women who gave birth while living in the war zone in Donbas, often staying with their newborns in cold, damp cellars for months. Lesia Chomienko's monumental painting, Max in the Army, is the most personal of her works so far. This full figure portrait of Chomienko's partner, an artist himself joining the territorial defense earlier this year in Ukraine, was painted in March. The bravado brushwork and the monumental scale only make the civilian going to war look more lost. Chomienko deconstructs historical paintings by comparing history and myths and exposing visual manipulations, and provocatively asks, if there are still wars in this world, why can't there still be painting? For years, she has been subverting Soviet traditions of monumental, heroic, glamorous and glorious paintings of war. And certainly all this experience and interest went into this work. Some landscapes of the left bank Ukraine by Anna Sherbina that you see here subvert the historical genre of painting ruins popular in the 18th century Europe and depict the devastation of Donbas in miniature watercolor landscapes. At such tiny scale, it is almost impossible to perceive the damage, and they seem lyrical. In order to force the viewer to look closer, Sherbina mimics the displays of watercolors in Ukrainian museums and covers each with a cloth, inviting us to lift it. So you see, I've already moved from focusing on women's fate into focusing on how war is presented. Indeed, in the case of these two painters, we focus on how war is presented in art history. And of course, Lesia Homienko, in the painting of her boyfriend, also pointed to the very strikingly different fate of women and men during the war in Ukraine. Men cannot leave the country. They are separated. She's right now in the United States, and he remains in Ukraine. There are other ways, though, in which artists focus on historiography. And let me quote Dana Kavelina, whose drawings we looked at before. We also showed her film. Here is how it was presented. Kavelina explores perceptions of war outside mainstream narratives. Because there is no objective history, she states, the question of whom we empower to make a record. She proposes that history, which is told from the military, masculine, and nationalist viewpoint, needs to be rewritten in a way to capture the unimaginable complexity and intricacy of the historical process and preserve the multiplicity of voices. Such a structure cannot be linear. It would rather resemble a matrix. Her profoundly feminist proposal has it that history should be written as a collective, rather than be the record of winners. And even though the main figure of her film is a woman, she really tries to present a much more complex history of Donbas that is present in public discussion in Ukraine. Let me not go into details of political aspects of this work here. We hope that it will be screened later this fall in New York again. Another artist investigating the role of art in historiography is Evgenia Belarusets, whom you may know from her Kiev diary, which was published online at in Art Forum this spring. A social activist, photographer, and accomplished writer, she explores the ways to render truth and attain objectivity in documentary art. My artistic and political intention is to make the invisible visible, wrote Belarusets. Victories of the Defeated that you're looking at is a series of more than 150 photographs and text devoted to post-industrial Ukraine, work in coal mines at the edge of the war zone, and contemporary forms of labor. Belarusets' aim was to make visible the peaceful life in the life zone that is overshadowed by media, images of war, and bring attention to the most vulnerable groups left behind, who resist the war that engulfs them. Working on the project, she collaborated with trade unions and local labor activists, many of them women, such as Vera Yastrebova portrayed here, a lawyer from Lysychansk and a founder of the organization Public Labor Control. Belarusets wrote, quote, "They say that history is written by the victorious, but might it be possible to read or listen to a history written by the defeated?" She refers to Wittgenstein Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, where he concludes that only facts, not aesthetic and ethical judgments, can be expressed with logical language. Therefore, the artist resists narrativity and proposes fragmentation as a means to present objective truth. By inserting into the public sphere images of what is intentionally excluded from the media and public awareness, she wishes to destabilize the informational war's constricted view of reality. In conditions of the violence of war, again, I'm quoting Belarusics, and the divisiveness of any information, it is essential that we find a way back to the demands of the legal and ethical inviolability of human beings. Okay, let's move a little faster to finish. This is Alevtina Kakhidzes, Strawberry Andreevna series, one of the best known artworks done during this war about Donbas, and it follows daily life of the artist's mother, who remained in the occupied territories in Donbas. It starts in April 2014, when fights between armed separatists of the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic and the Ukrainian National Guard broke out in her village, Zdanivka. The series covers 5 years of their conversations until January 16, 2019, when the artist's mother died of cardiac arrest while crossing the demarcation line between the self-proclaimed DPR and Ukraine to collect her pension. She was among 500,000 Ukrainian retirees living in the separatist territories who registered as displaced persons in Ukraine in order to receive their payment. We see here sort of a diagram how she had to go through several military checkpoints on both sides of the demarcation line, first the separatists and then Ukraine, several times a month. Another 7,100 retirees, I'm sorry, 700,000, living there had no access to their pensions at all. Personal history proved a powerful way to evoke empathy among Ukrainians with those who, for various reasons, remained in the occupied Donbas. And another strong subject among these artists that several works touch upon is mental health, which I thought was very interesting to observe. So strikingly centrally presented. Dana Kavelina, for example, wrote, "Depression is the only adequate strategy in a situation where it is impossible to influence real political processes." Here is the work by Katerina Yermolayeva, who reacted to losing her home in Donbas and her entire life there with a personal crisis that led her to explore first traditional gender roles, then herself as a non-binary character, and then herself as a multiplicity of personas. Another work that discusses the mental health during the war is this photograph by Olya Fedorova, documentation of her site-specific installation in which she wrote, "We try to defend ourselves from the war virus, but all our attempts are just as naive and ephemeral as paper anti-tank hedgehogs under the caterpillars of armored vehicles." That's the work done in 2017 by the artist who lived in Kharkiv, which was then still not attacked by the Russians. It was the spring, and Olya spent almost 3 months under shelling. And this last artwork that I will discuss briefly is the central piece of the exhibition, or rather its anchor. It's the only historical work by Awa Horska, who was born in 1929 and died in 1970. And this work situates this contemporary art exhibition in the context of the legacy of women's art and political activism in Ukraine. Both Awa Horska, an artist and human rights activist who was born in a Russian-speaking family in Crimea, but learned Ukrainian herself, and poet and literary critic Ivan Svetlichny, whom she portrayed in this linocut in 1963, fought to preserve Ukraine's culture and language under the communist regime. In 1960, both were among Shizdesyatniki, which you can translate as the 60ers, a movement of dissident literati, artists and scholars who rejected socialist realism and spread ideas of Ukrainian democratic and national revival. The group laid the foundations for the realization of the right of the Ukrainian people to statehood. Svetlichny served 7 years in labor camp and 5 years in internal exile. Horska was murdered by KGB at the age of 41 in 1970. But before she was murdered, she was expelled from the Union of Ukrainian Artists twice, first for representing a national Ukrainian poet in stained glass window in the foyer of the National University in Kiev, and secondly, second time, importantly, for her active opposition to political trials of 1967-70. And during this time, when she was unable to work in Kiev, she collaborated with other artists on monumental mosaics and frescoes on public buildings in Donetsk. Some of these masterpieces depicted the builders of communism, while others were joyful and magical interpretations of Ukrainian folk art. Her mosaics, some of which were registered as protected monuments by Ukrainian artists who were in this exhibition, are now being bombed by the Russians. So beyond those layers of giving the legacy of women's art and political activism, she is also somebody who ties all these works focused on Donbass and Donbass iconography, that I didn't discuss here in greater detail. It's 5:55, and I don't think I need to summarize this exhibition. I'd rather be interested in your asking questions than me speaking even more. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks so much, Monika. In fact, I just typed in for everyone in the chat. There are just a few minutes for the public to be with us, which is a very small number, but a few of you. So Basha, Michael, Adele, Tracy, if you have any questions, now's your chance to type something into the chat. And of course, if you want to show yourselves, that's great too. And if you are absolutely silent and don't have any comments, then what we're going to do is open this to the students in the program, and you can stay on for a few more minutes, but then at 6, I'm going to ask you to leave so that this is just for the students. So let's begin. I'd like to start to kick things off with a few questions. Monika, that was really interesting to think across different aspects of feminism. And at one point in your talk, you mentioned the difference between Eastern European feminism and Western. And I was wondering if you could just address that, and not only address it specifically in terms of ideology, but also in terms of the way that that influences your own thinking in curating feminist shows.
That's a very interesting question. It was the first exhibition, now Women at War, that allowed me to ever touch this subject and even discuss it, I think, openly. I've always been aware of that. I've been raised and educated. I graduated from art history in Warsaw, Poland. So, of course, I belong to that cultural realm, but my entire professional life is tied to New York City, where I have lived for 22 years. So I have to say that one of the main reasons why I really doubted I should curate Women at War, an exhibition of Ukrainian artists, was that for so many years I was really focused on the research of American feminist art, and it was quite a shocking coming back to the roots, not directly but somehow. The main difference, I think, is that women in every generalization is always difficult, but let's start with making sure that we understand there are class differences between women. So, for example, even if in the West, generally, women were given certain freedoms during the wars, and then usually they were pushed back to the confines of domestic sphere to take care of home. They very often could not work professionally and were focused on raising children and taking care of the family. This was not the case of many women from lower classes and many women of color who had children and worked. You even see this shift between feminist artists of color and white women, where so many more often women of colors had children while white women didn't, choosing their art, their profession to be artists, choosing to be an artist as their profession. I'm sorry. In Eastern Europe, there was a vast propaganda of female equality, which had actual grounds. Bolsheviks in 1917 gave women the right to vote in Soviet Union. In 1918, they gave women the right to divorce. And in 1920, legalized and free, if done in public hospitals, abortion. So there were grounds for feminist ideas and a sense of women equality, except for in the mid-1930s, a lot of these votes were revoked, and the atmosphere changed back towards traditionalism. And therefore, women still believed that they are equal to men. But during the next 70 or however many years, and that does not only applies to Soviet Union, but also to the entire Eastern Bloc, they worked in factories, often in traditionally male jobs, or used heavy machinery, worked, for example, in building the subway systems in different cities, in various cities. But on the other hand, they still had to take care of children, and they still were supposed to, be of good conduct or whatever you call it, right? So that's a very general concept. But when you look at Eastern European return to conservative, political conservatism and traditionalism today, that's something that is at stake there, the position of women who, after communism fell, sort of went back to embrace their femininity because that felt like freedom.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that answer. We could spend the next half hour talking about that in itself, but Basha has written a question, if you want to look in chat, Monika.
Yes, one of my fascinations has been with the women of the Peshmerga who fight with the Kurds and seem to be glamorized in any portrayals I have seen of them. Do you have any opinion on why this is so, and if this is helpful to your women or not? I don't know this. So I would have to look at, the historical records and understand. Are you referring to a particular artwork or?
Basha, if you want to speak.
Sure. It's mostly been photography that I've seen. I haven't seen any renderings or paintings or anything like that, but I've seen a lot of photography of Kurdish women who have been portrayed in a very, glamorous warrior way. And I just wondered if you had seen anything like that in your.
Oh, now I understand your question. It's an excellent question. One of my first ideas when I started when I already knew that I would do an exhibition of feminist art focused on war, I expected to see some warrior representations. We all know Linda Noughlin's essay. I didn't find them. It doesn't mean that they don't exist. Please make sure you know that I don't claim to have researched everything. The war is ongoing, which was particularly difficult for me to curate through. The lives of all my artists were affected. They became refugees between us starting to work and us having the exhibition shown. They changed the country in which they lived. So everything changed. But because this is an ongoing war, I don't know what kind of artworks women will do when this war is over. I hope this war is over as soon as possible and we can learn. It may change, it may not change, but it's a fantastic question. I didn't see this kind of like gender role reversal in a direct way or quite to the contrary. They were really, and I looked at the works of at least 50 women artists in Ukraine, at least, and they really were focused on rejecting glamorization and heroism in the representations of war and focusing on the fact that actually everyone is defeated who is affected by the war. And especially the parts of the society which are, poorer, weaker, in some way already during the peaceful times left behind.
Pasha, do you have anything more you want to ask about that?
No, but thank you for your answer. And I'm very interested. I wish I had seen your show, The Women at War. I hope this, I went to the website and looked at it briefly.
It will travel, so hopefully you will have an
Yeah,
opportunity to
one of
see
my interests is in refugees, and how we are all refugees of some kind, and we will all become refugees if we don't deal with the climate crisis. But war produces so many refugees, and Europe is filled with Syrian refugees running from war, and along with Ukrainians who have also had to leave. But it's a very compelling subject for me as a painter, as an artist. You're trying to depict it in some way. But I had, also this fascination of the Peshmerga women. I would recommend, that people look at them and to see what they think, because it's kind of an interesting difference that I saw with how your artists are depicting, battle and war.
Thank you. I wrote it down and I'm definitely going to research this.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks so much, Monika.